And lastly, my original questioner, why are we in this at all? Aren't we trying to shove our values down the throats of other denominations, other individuals? Why is government, matter of fact, I had this exchange with a person, and he started saying, you can't do this and you can't do that. And I said, yeah. I said, you're Catholic, right? He said, yes. I said, well, do you believe that marriage is a sacrament? He says, yes. Here's my question to you. Why is government involved in marriage at all? Has anybody ever asked you that question? Why is government interested in marriage in any way, shape, or form? Does government get involved in the ordination of clergy? No, they can't. If marriage is a religious rite, then why should government be interested in it? What value does government have? Should government be, if marriage is the ability of two individuals to express their love to one another, which is a common popular definition, why should the government care? Can sisters express their love to one another? Yes. Can close friends who grew up through high school express their love to one another without having to go through a governmental sanction? Of course. Matter of fact, if the government started getting involved in those kinds of relationships, you would be offended. I can't call you my best friend until I register with the local county? Think about that. So why is this emotionally based relationship something the government should trouble itself at all over? The answer is that the government doesn't care about your emotionally based relationships, and it doesn't want to get involved. The government does, though, have a responsibility to children. The government has a responsibility to make sure that children are protected and provided for. It has a huge responsibility there. The government needs to promote those things that will benefit its members most, and marriage is the basis of perpetuating society. It is where our next generation comes from. The only reason government is involved in marriage at all is because it is the way that children are bonded to their mothers and fathers. Now, let's think about this. Throughout history, identifying a mother is pretty easy, right? Even if she hides away someplace for the birth and maybe nobody sees it, she's been showing usually for a couple of months, right? Oh, you've got that glow. And now that there's Facebook, you'll see every week how much she's showing. And then one day she's not showing anymore and she has a baby in her arms. It's not hard to bind a child to its mother because of the biology of it. It's pretty easy. But how do you bind the biology of the child to the father? How do we understand what man is responsible for this child now? Traditionally, the way societies have done so is the man has betrothed himself to his wife, promised to be with her, and in that marriage coupling, the child is automatically coupled to the father because it is assumed that you will consummate that marriage. Matter of fact, in most cultures, you weren't considered married until consummation happened. So it is that physical act that seals the deal, if you will. And it is that way that fathers are bound to their children and recognized as a family unit. Paul Nathanson, again, writes that there are at least 5 functions that marriage serves in every culture, and that these 5 functions are necessary for cultures to survive and thrive. They are, number 1, to foster the bonding between men and women. Okay? Marriage fosters the bonding between, if men and women aren't married, men tend to treat women like dirt. It's true. It fosters the birth and rearing of children. Once you're married, the idea of family is a much more natural process, much more capable idea. It fosters the bonding between the men and the children because they are theirs. We're seeing more and more studies show up now where stepfathers is actually more of an indicator of abuse in a home, and that step-parents tend to especially if there's biological children and stepchildren. No matter how much they may try, their stepchildren tend to sometimes get the short end of the stick, just as statistically. I'm not talking individually. It fosters some form of healthy masculine identity, and it fosters the transformation of adolescents into sexually responsible adults. It's the adolescents who model themselves after the behavior of their parents, and if their parents are married, monogamous individuals who treat each other with respect, it is the adolescents who learn that. He says, quote, because heterosexuality is directly related both to reproduction and survival, every human society has had to promote it actively. Heterosexuality is always fostered by a cultural norm that limits marriage unions of men and women. He adds that people, quote, are always wrong in assuming any society can do without it. So marriage is essential in rearing well-adjusted children. Author and sociologist David Popenoe confirms that mothers and fathers fulfill different roles in the children's lives. In his book, Life Without Father, Popenoe notes, quote, throughout their play, as well as in other child-rearing activities, fathers tend to stress competition, challenge, initiative, risk-taking, and independence. Mothers, in their caretaking roles, in contrast, stress emotional security and personal safety. I can vouch for this. It is the dad who will first take the child and go, whew, and the mom will go, ah! This has happened to me more. By our fourth one, it's like no big deal anymore. You know, the first one, have you ever guys, you see that, right? The first kid, you're like, oh, he dropped his binky, and you put that one in to be sterilized, and you get the new one out of the saran wrap in the drawer. By the fourth one, it's like, huh? You're done. Just lick it, shove it. The kid's made of rubber. They'll bounce back. Not a big. This is how parenting works. But guys will want to push the independent value of their children, while mothers are now mothers are important. Don't get me wrong. Mothers provide an important flexibility and sympathy in their discipline, but fathers provide the ultimate predictability and consistency. Both dimensions are crucial for an efficient, balanced, and humane child-rearing regime. We need both. The Maryland Supreme Court in 2007, a case called Conway versus Dean, agreed with this. They wrote, quote, we agree that the state's asserted interest in fostering procreation is a legitimate governmental interest. As one of the fundamental rights recognized by the Supreme Court as a matter of personal autonomy, procreation is considered one of the most important of the fundamental rights. See, fundamental right, natural right. In light of the fundamental nature of procreation and the importance placed on it by the Supreme Court, safeguarding an environment most conducive to the stable propagation and continuance of the human race is a legitimate governmental interest. So that's my point, is governments have a responsibility to protect children. In the same way that governments have a responsibility to educate children. So sometimes if you're talking with folks, you can ask them about this. You know, does the government have a right to take my taxes and use them in the public schools when my child is going off to private school and I'm paying for that? Or we're a couple that's infertile, we have no children, yet we're paying public school taxes. Is that fair? Is that right? The government would probably say, yes, it's fair and right, because we know that the education of a generation will produce benefits beyond the individual to strengthen the generation as a whole, right? This is what we're all about when we start talking about test scores and why aren't American kids doing as well as European kids? How are we going to get all the best jobs? If we don't get the best jobs, our economy is going to go in the tank and everybody suffers, right? We know this. So if the government has an interest in promoting the education of children, then doesn't the government also have an interest in promoting the living specificity of the child being raised? In other words, if we know that raising a child with a mother and father, biological mother and father, is the best way to raise a child, we don't bar people from sending their kids to private school or homeschool them, right? That's not illegal, at least not yet. But we promote education within the government. In the same way, we don't bar people from living together or divorcing, but we wish as a government to promote the marital union of husband and wife because that's the best environment in which to rear children. A biological child reared by their biological parents. That's just simply the best way to go, and all the studies are showing this. It's not even a cat fight anymore in this, no matter what folks say. So, the government has a compelling interest in children. So here's what okay, now that's a lot of this is like maybe esoteric, stuff. And it's going to be hard for you to give that kind of a speech when you're talking to somebody at work, in the morning, or at school. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you a couple of questions that you can start to ask people. But all of that is background now that you can start using when we start discussing marriage, okay? And how are we doing on time? Okay, I'm all right. First question, why only 2? This is an easy one. Why only 2? Okay? This happened to come up again in the Supreme Court case. Justice Alito. He says, suppose we rule in your favor in this case, and then after that, a group consisting of 2 men and 2 women apply for a marriage license. Would there be any grounds for denying them a license? Remember, the government, Bernardo, is arguing that marriage shouldn't be withheld from homosexual couples because they have a fundamental right to love each other in this relationship. Her argument is based on feeling, on the satisfaction that individuals give by binding themselves to one another. I don't think the government's interest is in that. And by the way, there are other legal ways that you can do that. Corporations, for example, are ways individuals bind themselves to one another into a single corporate entity. So if people want to bind themselves to one another, there may be other legal avenues to do that. Don't call it marriage, because that's not what it is. And this is what Alito's asking. He's saying, what if there's 2 men and 2 women, and they all want to get married? What about 3, a throuple, or a quad, as this were? But Ms. Bonato said, there'd be 2. So he's saying, would there be any grounds for denying them a marriage license? There'd be 2. One is whether the state would even say that this is such a thing as marriage. Yeah, that's kind of what we're arguing right now, right? This doesn't fit the criteria of marriage. But she's saying that 4 don't work as a marriage. So one would be whether the state would even say that this is such a thing as marriage. But then, beyond that, there's definitely going to be concerns about coercion and consent and disrupting family relationships when you start talking about multiple persons. And Alito says, well, what if there's none of these? These are people, men and women. It's not the sort of polygamous marriages that existed in other societies and still exist. Oh, no, I'm sorry, this is Bonato. It's not the sort of polygamous relationship that existed in other societies and still existed today. And Alito says, well, let's assume that they're all highly educated. Let's assume they're all lawyers, he says to the lawyer. What would be the ground under the logic of the decision you would like us to hand down? So if we decide that marriage is whatever individuals who want to bind to one another in a lasting relationship is, if that's the criteria for marriage, what would be the logic in denying these people that right? Mrs. Bonato said, number 1, I assume the state would rush in and say that when you're talking about multiple people joining into a relationship, that is not the same thing as we've had in marriage, which is on the mutual support and consent of 2 people. And he says, well, I don't know what kind of distinction that is, because a marriage between 2 people of the same sex is not something we've had before. It's the same, you're talking in a circle. Recognizing that it's a substantial break. Maybe this is a good one, but if so, why is there no break? Why should the break be at 2? So basically, I think this first question, this brings out the biology. Why do you think there's 2? Because you can't make a baby with 3 or 4. Seriously, I mean, it goes back to the biology. It goes back to nature. It goes back to what Paul is saying. It takes 2, no more than 2, and no less than 2 people to produce a child. Marriage and procreation are linked, even if the marriage doesn't directly produce procreation. Marriage and procreation are linked because procreation, properly applied, happens within marriage. That's why there's only 2. So one of your questions with other people is, why 2? Why not 4? Why not 3? What's the difference in your point of view if marriage is a feeling, if marriage is satisfaction for the adults involved? Why only 2? What reason, what grounding do you have for stopping there if it's only based on feeling? If it's based on biology, I've got it. Only two people can make a baby. Simple. Second question, who protects the children? Who protects the children? In 2013, 2 years ago, there was an article that came out in the Los Angeles Times about the city council elections in the city of Los Angeles. And entitled An All-Male City Council, the reporter was very concerned about what was going on in the elective process of Los Angeles County. He writes, at least 13 of the 15 council seats will be filled after July 1st. The city attorney will be a man, and Gruel's successor, who is a female controller, will be the controller. However, the other 2 seats have one woman candidate. So 13 of the 15 seats, all male candidates, not a woman in the bunch. Of the 2 seats that had a female candidate running, they were very unlikely, and I haven't checked the results of the election, so I don't know, but the female candidate was very unlikely to win. They weren't the favorite. So they're writing, and they're concerned, we could have, for the first time in years and years, an all-male city council in a city the size of LA, where women comprise, 6 million people, 3 million of them are female. This is a concern for us. He asks, does it matter? Newton receives his answer from Laura Chick, a previously elected city official. Chick responds, quote, absolutely it makes a difference. Our brains are different. We have different perspectives. There's something terribly wrong with this. The term for someone serving on a Los Angeles City Council is 4 years. And Newton called the idea of 4 years of all-male leadership, quote, a startling setback. Is that concerning? Now, I agree that women offer a different voice than men, a different perspective. We heard about that with Paul Nathanson talking about the family. Well, here's my question to the liberal. If it's as important, if it's a serious setback, if it's a big problem to have an all-male city council that meet once a week, where each representative stands in for tens of thousands of people and only has a limited amount of impact on their lives, how important then is it to have a dual-sex parenting union that plays the most important role in a child's life for the first 18 years he's living? If having a mixed-sex city council is crucial, isn't having a mixed-sex parenting unit even more so? Right? Or, since we're a bite-sized community, here's the one that you tweet. Which parent is unnecessary? Do children not need a father, or do they not need a mother? I asked somebody that. Well, it's neither. No, they're both necessary, but what about single mothers? Single mothers exist, but single mothers happen mostly out of accident. Either they weren't planning on getting pregnant and they got pregnant, or the guy left them, or it wasn't, for the most part, designed that the child would be brought into the world as a child that has no father. Orphans are the same way. Orphans are not our best case scenario. Nobody would ever decide to bring children into the world intentionally as orphans. Okay, we're going to rear these children and make them orphans. That's our goal, right? You would never do that. But when a homosexual couple brings a child into the world, they are intentionally depriving that child of either a mother or a father by design. Now, are they doing that for the child's best interest, or are they looking for their own? And if they're doing it for their own best interest, isn't it the government's responsibility to try and mitigate that as much as possible? I'm not saying that it'll be illegal for anybody to ever do this. I don't know that you can process that. But we certainly don't want to condone it. We certainly don't want to encourage that. Those things happen. Single motherhood happens. Nobody wants to encourage single motherhood. So why would we encourage fatherless children or motherless children? It doesn't make sense. What binds children to their parents? That's the question. How do we get children and parents together? So, these two questions, I think, are key when we're talking about natural marriage. Why only two? You know, it used to be when you would say things like, you know, you do this and we're going to have two problems. We're going to have polygamy, polyandry. We're going to have multiple, right, polyamory is some of the ways they call it, multiple constituent unions. And, you know, what stops certain ideas of pedophilia? If a child can be tried legally as an adult at 14, then why can't that child be legally married at 14? That's a key concern. If the government restricts marriage because it is a danger to a 14-year-old child who's not emotionally ready to accept that yet, then the government is showing a compelling interest in limiting marriage for the sake of the child. Now we have our basis for limiting marriage between homosexual people for the sake of the child. Again, the ideology is the same. If we can limit polygamy to two individuals, the marriage is two individuals, not multiple individuals, what process other than biology, other than the fact that they raise children, do you offer to that limitation? So I think those are two very, very powerful questions that when pressed, I don't think the other side has a good answer for.